Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Can you hear me okay? Okay, awesome, thanks. I'm honored to welcome you this morning to the symposium, Belonging, Native American Art in Settler Contexts. My name is Emily Burns, and I'm the director of the Russell Center for the Study of Art of the American West here in the School of Visual Arts at the University of Oklahoma. Long before the University of Oklahoma was established, the land on which the university now resides was the traditional home of the Haznai Caddo Nation and the Kirikiris, Wichita, and affiliated tribes. We acknowledge this territory once also served as a hunting ground, trade exchange point, and migration route for the Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, and Osage nations. Today, 39 tribal nations dwell in the state of Oklahoma as a result of settler and colonial policies that were designed to assimilate Native people. The University of Oklahoma recognizes the historical connection our university has with its Indigenous community. We acknowledge, honor, and respect the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this land. We fully recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereign rights of all of Oklahoma's 39 tribal nations. This acknowledgement is aligned with our university's core value of creating a diverse and inclusive community. It is an institutional responsibility to recognize and acknowledge the people, culture, and history that make up our entire OU community. Our land acknowledgement is an important articulation of the place on which today we gather and its layers of memory. And still more is needed from all of us to support Native American communities and makers by consuming the work of Native American makers in all genres, in scholarship, in theater, in fiction, poetry, the visual arts, film, and more. I'm also now convinced that all symposia need to be preceded by plays. I hope many of you were able to join our opening events last night. This series of events also seeks to provide action building on the acknowledgement to commit to conversations about histories of art, material form, and cultural meaning for all makers in the American West. We are grateful to our collaborators and sponsors, funding from the Merkel Family Foundation, the Office of the Vice President for Research's Initiative for the Humanities and Arts Seed Grant, the OU Department of Women and Gender Studies, and the Terra Foundation for American Art all enabled these events to be possible. Intellectually, I would like to express gratitude for collaboration from my SOVA colleagues, Dr. Alicia Harris and Dr. Eve Chavez, on the symposium theme, the panel topics, and our speakers list. In that vein, I also thank Dr. Laura Harjo, Dr. Farina King, Dr. Mel Fillmore, and America Meredith from First American Art Magazine for their collegiality and support. Thanks to Brent Goddard, who is generously managing our tech and live stream today, and also to Sharon Burchett and Amber Dubois Shepherd for their administrative support within the School of Visual Arts. I also want to thank our student helpers, both graduate and undergraduate, who have picked up speakers at the airport, given tours, and who will also help with facilitating today. And they are here if you have any questions or concerns. And maybe I'll just ask the grads to all stand up so that everyone can identify you. Megan, Andy, Taylor, Jonathan Hacker, I see Abby and Saray. If there's anyone else I missed, thank you all. And if you see them around, I'm sure they'd also love to chat with you about their research projects. I also thank our museum staff here at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum for hosting us, especially Lisa Campbell, Kathy Lai, and Museum Director Thomas Brent Smith. Also my colleague administrators in the School of Visual Arts office, Allison Fields and Robert Bailey, and from the Arts and Humanities Forum, Kim Marshall and Mac Krebs. Lastly, I thank our generous chairs and speakers who enable this conversation by joining to share their ideas, thoughts, and experiences about belongings. If you'll indulge me in a little etymology, while many often use the English term belonging to lightly signify possession, my notebook, for instance, the word itself embeds much deeper feeling. To be enlivens a fundamental ontological sense of being. Since the 14th century, the term, which has Germanic origins, means to properly relate to. So relation is conceptually embedded from the term's beginning, and it did not come to signify possession until the 18th century in England. Intriguing, too, is the root long within it. This refers both to the emotion of relation, a sense of longing in connection, as well as a temporal trajectory of a durational long time of extended connectivity. And when we think more about our notebook, even this notebook can be seen through this lens, not as a mere material form, but also an extension of the mind and heart, pointing to a deeper reading of the term belonging than a static or inanimate possession. This symposium pushes the concept further, exploring how for many Native American epistemologies or worldviews, belonging points to animacy and agency, often with specific words in Indigenous languages to point to what Heather Auton describes as, quote, the epistemological connection between matter, being, and the cycles that bind us in an ever-occurring cosmic dance, end quote. In this framing, a relation within a community and activated across time and space that is not only, it is one that is not only related to, but one that also relates back. Belonging inflects interconnected ties among people, place, and material forms. It has also become a productive word in museum spaces, rethinking how they engage with Native American collections. In 2022, for instance, Narragansett Niantic curator Lauren Spears with educator Amanda Thompson published the Tomahawk Museum's Collection Management Policy, which frames Native American material forms as belongings rather than artifacts or objects. And this term highlights made material forms' participation in knowledge systems centered around animate relationality, and that, quote, recognizes that they are interconnected to the cultural context of their creation and maintain connections to people, both historical and contemporary. They are not scientific data or a thing divorced from its culture. And I'll just offer one brief example to illustrate this point, which will be engaging with great nuance throughout the day's conversations. Nancy Josephine Clark, one of our invited speakers who unfortunately could not attend due to illness in her family, is a Blackfeet artist based in Seattle. Her creative practice responds to the legacy of connection between the painter Charles M. Russell and her grandmother, Blackfeet model Josephine Wright, through belongings. After beginning a friendship with Nancy Cooper, a settler woman who later married Charles Russell, when the two met working as household help in a home in Great Falls, Montana, Wright posed for hundreds of Russell's paintings. And the Blackfeet two-hide dress she often wore appears in many of these artworks. This dress still lives in Russell's studio collection in Great Falls, Montana. In the scholarship on Russell, such a belonging is summarily dismissed as a prop or an artifact. Much more could be said to gloss this, but in brief, this dress instead speaks to human, non-human relations. It references origin stories, metaphysics, and Blackfeet mokaksini, or knowledge, as it enacts connections between human, animal, and spirit worlds, and fosters relationality for the maker and the wearer through its carefully stitched beadwork. Clark's work reminds us that this dress was always more than a prop. In her Russell series of 2014, it is replicated at the core of her patterned scene as a belonging. She pairs it in repetition with Russell's signature bison skull, and this becomes refigured from its omen of a so-called dying West into a diagram of relations, which Clark frames through icons from Blackfeet visual culture, as well as from her own personal history in Seattle. And you can trace corn stalks and space needles as you look at this drawing. Clark shows her grandmother's dress and its role as a connective tissue, a sinew between past, present, and future, with animacy and relationality highlighting simultaneously ancestry and futurity. And this continues to propel Clark's work. She sends her regards to everyone and also told me the other day that her current artwork project she is calling Belongings, Where Do I Belong? This multivocal symposium analyzes belongings and celebrates creative practices in which Native American writers and makers have engaged with the appropriation and display of Native American belongings in museum spaces. Tied to histories of dispossession, genocide, and erasure, the staggering numbers of human remains and made material forms animated by an understanding of connective energy embedded within them that were stolen from Native American communities or purchased under duress, present continued challenges for museums which seek to redress for historical and epistemic violence. With community members, artists, art historians, writers in various genres, and curators, today's discussions consider how belongings might be defined and how both creative and academic writing, art, and oral histories grapple with settler colonial appropriations of belongings. This multidisciplinary approach that entwines creative making in many media and academic inquiry across the humanities enables us to harness the tools of our respective disciplines together towards addressing a crucial social concern and working towards a future and an academy that recognizes the endurance of the creative spirit, allows for the coexistence of multiple epistemologies or ways of knowing, the entwinement of beings and of temporalities, and the complex interweaving of human existence. With that, I just want to offer a few logistical notes. There is no food or drink allowed in this auditorium except water for speakers. So if you have either of those things and you want to enjoy them, just step outside into the vestibule. Also, I want to point out that there are emergency exits located. The door that you came in will lead you back to the staircase going out, but the door on my left will also take you to a hallway that will lead you out of the building. It is also possible, if you're seated at the front of the auditorium, to exit to my right behind the kind of stage access. To maximize our discussion time, we will not be reading the biographies of the speakers aloud. Please find them in the program, and if you're watching online, you can find them at the base of the registrations page with the full schedule. We will begin with one 2-hour session on defining belongings with 15-minute talks, followed by discussion. Dr. Carolyn Smith is unfortunately unable to join us, and Dr. Chavez will read her paper. This session will be followed by a lunch across the street at the Russell Center in the Old Faculty Club, which is catered by Tawan Thai. At 1:15, we'll reconvene for 2 panels about creative making in theater and in the visual arts. This will be followed by a coffee break. Blackfeet artist John Isaiah Pepion is not able to join us, so this panel will become a conversation between Dr. Annika Johnson and artist Holly Wilson. Then we'll have a 1-hour panel on Niitsitapi perspectives on Reynold Rice's portraits. From there, we will migrate over to the Zarrow School of Social Work for dinner catered by Junebug and a reception, and with a final closing lecture by Angeline Booley, followed by a book signing. Books will be available for sale there and also during our coffee break this afternoon, including a page-proof version of Dr. Chavez's Indigenizing California Mission, Art, and Architecture, which is weeks away from being in print, and there's a flyer with a coupon code so you can pre-order that book. This morning, from about 11 until lunchtime, you'll also find a group of students from OU's Indigenous Art Forms Club selling beadwork out in the vestibule outside of the auditorium. Lastly, I wanted to note that there is a QR code on the back of your program where you'll find a brief anonymous survey if you would like to provide us any feedback on your experience of these events. To those of you joining us online via YouTube, please do feel free to drop comments and questions in the chat, noting that you need to log in order to post on YouTube. But we have students in the auditorium who are following the live stream and can read out into the room. With that welcome and humble gratitude to everyone in this room, I turn to Dr. Chavez, who will chair our first session, Defining Belongings. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, for that introduction. And thank you to all of you here in person and on the live stream for attending the panel Defining Belongings. I have the honor of introducing our 4 panelists. Clementine Bordeaux is an enrolled member of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe. Clementine is a 2023-2025 University of California President's and Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of English at UC Riverside. Mary Deliri is an Anishinaabe Kwe from Deshkan Zibing, Chippewas of the Thames First Nation. Deliri is the director of the Research Center for Contemporary Native Arts at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Elizabeth Hutchinson is Associate Professor of Art History at Barnard College at Columbia University. And Carolyn Smith is an enrolled descendant of the Karuk tribe and Assistant Professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. And please join me in welcoming Clementine Bordeaux.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Okay, cool. I'm gonna start my stopwatch so I don't go over. Iele midakyapi, chante washte nape chuzapi, Clementine Bordeaux imachiapi kshto, Wazia haha and mataha na leha mini luzaha otuahe awatie. Hello, everyone. I greet you with a heartfelt handshake. I'm Clementine Bordeaux. I'm an enrolled member of the Sichangu Oglala Lakota Oyate, and I currently live in Rapid City, South Dakota, but I grew up on the Pine Ridge Reservation. And so today, I'm really excited to be here. I'm glad I get to go first because, I can set the bar kind of low so you all can shine. But I'm really excited, and just thank you, Emily, for inviting me, and Eve and Alicia for organizing this, and of course, all the faculty, staff, and students that helped put this together. In my research, I trace the intersection of art, kinship, and land and culture as part of a Lakota intellectual tradition. I utilize relationality as the tool methodologically and theoretically to communicate the interrelatedness of Lakota kinship values, our cultural connection to other than human nations, and creative practice. And when I say creative practice, it's however one might categorize or encompass art making in varied context. And when settler institutions fail to capture these intersectional nuances of place-based intellect and creative practice, I find my way back to the people and places I know intimately. Our sites of relational significance are where I understand and define the everyday belongings that contribute to the continuum of Northern Plains tribal cultures. And I would never call myself an expert, but these are ones that I share readily as someone who has thought deeply about connection to place through the production and exchange of art. And of course, I lean on these material locations as visually significant localities of Oceti Sakowin life. When I say Oceti Sakowin, I mean Nakota, Dakota, Lakota speaking communities. And so by leaning on these localities, I'm able to illustrate why land and other than human nations are central to Lakota relationality, and in turn are significant to our understanding of belongings. So when I talk about sites of relational significance, I talk about places like Bear Butte, which is pictured here. Bear Butte is one of the places that we understand our kinship connections and help shape the ways that we create and share with each other. And so my work looks directly at these intersections, also to articulate a idea of the everyday material culture that comes from these places, and the everyday material culture that I am responsible to and responsible for. So I engage with these cultural frameworks to guide the ethics of my analysis. So these are the places, the materials, the people, the kinships that hold me accountable. And so in talking about these sites of relational significance, I wanted to briefly talk about the places where we store our belongings and how do we understand that. So the ethics embedded in these kinship places and our relationship to them help guide how we can discuss these things. And so, for example, these relationships are reflected in the cultural framing of the Black Hills. And for those that don't know, the Black Hills region is located in the Northern Plains. It's in the kind of southwest area of South Dakota and up against Wyoming. It's a hub of ceremonial and ritual sites of relational significance for a lot of tribal nations in the region. And Lakota people often refer to the Black Hills as a Weezy Pa or Weezy P, which was historically seen as like a parfleche bag or a trunk made to carry special things. And so when we refer to the Black Hills as a Weezy Pa or a Weezy P, we really have to start then getting down into the linguistics of this word. And I was really excited last night in the conversation about the places. Language kept coming up a lot. And I was like, okay, cool. I'm not like off the mark in this discussion. And maybe in another life, I would have been a linguist, but here I am, an ethnographer. So not to get, too in the weeds, but when breaking down this word Weezy P or Weezy Pa, Weezy, the part of the word Weezy, refers to the very old lodging or the smoky part of a teepee lodge. And that's then when that got too old, like when your teepee got too old, you would use that part to then make a wheezy paw. And then the P or the paw part of it is usually added to word to create plurality or encompass a lot of people. So another example is the word teepee, right? T means a place where they dwell or they live. And then the P is like encompassing the they. So when you say teepee, it literally just means a place where they dwell. So in the same, a wheezy paw is like, how are people using that old part of the lodge? And so when we're using that framework to encompass the Black Hills, we're literally saying that's the place where all of our special things are. That's where our knowledge comes from. That's where our kinship comes from. And so in using that and thinking about that as a grounding methodology to analyze how we're utilizing these places to create our belongings and also share our belongings, to store our belongings, it literally, the Black Hills, our place of these relational practices, is an ancient thing that holds stuff, which I know is kind of an informal translation, but it's the gist of this interpretation. And I prefer kind of thinking of it as that ancient place that carries things, because it also then helps me frame this idea of the everyday material culture. And so I have to imagine these tribally specific containers that hold our artistic knowledge to help me understand also a place of freedom, a place that is often regulated to the fringes of Native American Indigenous studies. I've often been told I get to do the fun research because I'm talking about art. And I'm like, well, you chose to talk about law and policy. I didn't. And vice versa, within a settler context, I feel like non-Native art historians are often are not interested in tribal autonomy outside the discourse of diplomacy. And I'm not interested in that either. And I do believe we are in a moment of, and we discussed it last night at the panel, but like all hands on deck. But I'm interested in how do we imagine material culture and our belongings to help us imagine a future that's outside of these contexts. So the creative practice my ancestors engaged with obviously are still operating today and aid in defining who we are as Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people. Art reflects a continuum of creative practice that, was used in politicized contexts, right? We could reference ledger drawings, quilting, performance art, quill or beadwork. And I want to think beyond those responses or counter-narrative frameworks that often historicize or homogenize our creative practice. Art is what grounds me and reminds me that I belong to a specific place. And so in defining belongings, we need to consider these place-based aspects. And I think it's really great. Today we'll see a lot of these similar conversations. So I was really excited looking through the program. And so in that, I also want to share some belongings that inspire me in these conversations. So to begin, and I want to check time. Okay. I recently published a short essay discussing the Fairburn agate. And these agates are formed under sedentary pressure. So in the ancient seas that used to cover the northern plains, and again, maybe I would have been a geologist in another lifetime, but in the ancient seas that used to cover the northern plains, there were cavernous spaces left in the limestone. And as billions of years progress, silica and other trace minerals began to replace the limestone and create nodules or these geoformations that then birthed the Fairburn agate. And so these agates reflect billions of years of life. And this image is a Fairburn agate that was gifted to me by my uncle John Dwayne Gozen Center, who's a Lakota silversmith. And these stones are found regionally in the Northern Plains. He likes to call them Lakota agates, but you can find them as far as Montana. So maybe they're also Blackfeet agates too. I won't say they're Crow agates, but these belongings, these stones belong to and are from the earth, and they're specific. The Fairburn is specific to the Northern Plains. And as some of you know, rocks or stones play a significant role in some ceremonial life for Oceti-Sakowin communities. We utilize rocks in our purification ceremonies. We have stories of spirit rocks. And one of our more common creation stories, we are created from an omniscient being that gives them themselves and then becomes a rock. And so, although the Fairburn agate is not typically used in ceremonial practice, the agate is usually used as decoration or adornment. And so when John Dewayne uses the Fairburn agate, it helps me frame this way to approach Lakota way of life as we have always done. And I also think of it as an ethical grounding to this intersection of analyzing belongings. There are decades of work of scholars and practitioners like those in this room have strived to reframe material culture on a continuum of creativity instead of framing our art practice in a historicized way that often traps tribal artists within a specific art style or genre, or often gets dismissed because we're using new materials. But these belongings teach me about belonging. And so John Dewayne's aesthetic demonstrates this cultural continuum, which is evidence in our relationship with non-human nations like the Fairburn agate, places, and then our stories. And when I say stories, I also do not mean the flimsy stories used to weakly connect to a place or a tribal nation as a position of power, but the stories that represent our deep reciprocity, right? When I'm carrying these items or I'm sharing these items, it's because I'm creating kinship and I'm also making you responsible for me, for my community. And so, like our articulation of the Black Hills as Weezypan as a container of essential things, these adornments that are created by artists like John Dewayne are creating new containers of knowledge that ground us on the go. And furthermore, in defining belongings, I continue to rely on the language, animacy, and subjecthood of Oceti-Sakowin life and thinking about our relationship with the broad spectrum of the Northern Plains. These non-human relatives are also ones that I imagine as our everyday examples of tribal belonging, and that the ones that are operating outside of formal institutions. And so the material culture that reproduces our relationships with each other operate beyond the scope of aesthetics or the binaries created from the European Enlightenment that are embedded in those formal institutional spaces. And so, like many scholars today, we understand art and culture as part of the same whole, by which tribal creative practice should not be homogenized. And John Dewayne has often stated to me that his work is a production of the everyday, and he incorporates new ideas that are firmly positioned in a Lakota way of life, but are, creating and imagining new designs. And so when we have, these items, we have to ask ourselves, would our ancestors recognize these belongings as their belongings? And of course, my answer is yes. So in that, just checking time. Okay. And so in closing, I just want to think about how I often do not see myself reflected in the objects that I encounter being sold for a market-driven economy or in formal institutions when it's made for a non-native viewer. And like others surviving this current iteration of the settler nation state, Indigenous artists are doing their best. They also need to pay their bills. And I'm not dismissing that work that is operating within a capitalist objectification of work is not important, but that's also not a focus of my work. And I'm not denying the limitations of my own stance of this. And furthermore, I'm also, not every artwork has to be framed as decolonial or anti-colonial. Lakota people have been and obviously will continue to be in a precarious position within the settler colonial nation state. I don't know if any of you have visited South Dakota. It's probably very similar to Oklahoma, right? We've been fighting these fights for a very long time. And so I'm also encouraging us to think beyond the carceral logics of border town violence, of this embedded white supremacist racist rhetoric that's embedded in the way that we're looked at as tribal people, and really think about how we can think about our belongings, not just as visiting them in institutional settings, but the gift making and gift giving provided as a way for Lakota communities to honor each other. And so in closing, what happens when these entities that have established treaties or policies with us no longer exist? That's when we need to turn back to art and creative practice to demonstrate this continuum of ancestral belonging. Thank you.
Miigwech Clementine, that was wonderful. I am deeply inspired by the words that you had to share, and now I'm really worried that I might be off the mark here. So, Ani Kinawea, Minol Gija Baugat, good morning, it's a good day. Babongish go kwe, Dishnakaz, Deshkanzi, Bing and Donjaba, Nakikdo Dam Anishinaabe Kwe and Dell. I am Mary Delary. I am Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Lenape, Kwe woman from Chippewas, the Thames First Nation, located in Ontario, Canada. I am from the Otter Clan. I am, and my Anishinaabe name is Winter Sky Woman. So I wanted to make a quick note here about my presentation, and that I make references to human remains and burials, but I do not show any pictures of them, but I wanted to share that in case there are cultural sensitivities that we need to be aware of here. So this morning, I wanted to share some of the things that I've learned in my journey to find, reconnect, and recover Deishkan being Gete Anishinaabe. This presentation follows a timeline of sorts, mapping our way back to Gete Anishinaabe, and I hope to demonstrate how Gete Anishinaabe have been positioned in settler contexts and how I aim to understand Gete Anishinaabe and Anishinaabe contexts with my Anishinaabe relatives. In Ojibwe Moen, which is the language of the Ojibwe or Chippewa people, Deishkan refers to a place, a people, a river, spiritual beings that protect and navigate the river waters. It is also how we as Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, located in present-day Ontario, Canada, refer to ourselves. In Ojibwe Moen, Gete Anishinaabe refers to the old ones, elder or person of long ago. I began using Gete Anishinaabe as I was conflicted about using words such as item, object, artifact, words that minimized the history and significance that Gete Anishinaabe had and continue to have within our communities and families. The map that you see here shows Ojibwe or Chippewa camps along the Deishkan-Zibi, which is referred to by the French as Le Trench and is known in English today as the Thames River. This is the place that I am referring to, which is present-day southwestern Ontario, Canada. And Chippewas, the Thames First Nation, is located 20 minutes outside of London, Ontario, and roughly in the middle between Detroit and Toronto. This place is also known as Wawayatnong, Round Lake, and refers to Lake St. Clair, the heart of the Great Lakes. And Lake St. Clair, for Anishinaabe, this place is also known as a third stopping place in the Chibih-Modewin, a migration of the Three Fires Confederacy that took over 1,000 years to complete. On December 14th, 1797, a proclamation was issued by Peter Russell, Administrator of Upper Canada and Indian Affairs, addressing the destruction of Mississauga fishing and burial grounds. The proclamation stated, quote, "Whereas many heavy and grievous complaints have of late been made by the Mississauga Indians of depredations committed by some of His Majesty's subjects and others upon their fisheries and burial places, and of other annoyances suffered by them by uncivil treatment," end quote. The proclamation proceeds to describe that any person found guilty of desecrating the Mississauga fisheries and burial grounds shall be proceeded against with the utmost severity and proper example made by any herein offending. Early interventions to address the dispossession and desecration of Indigenous sites in Upper Canada, which includes present-day southwestern Ontario, were temporary solutions to a much bigger problem. Some of the earliest interactions between European settlers and Indigenous people led to many Indigenous sacred sites and burial sites looted and destroyed out of curiosity and entertainment. In 1872, an excerpt from Disinterred Warrior by William Bullen Bryant appeared in the Canadian Journal of Science, Literature, and History. It reads, "A noble race, but they are gone. With their old forests wide and deep, we have built our homes upon fields where their generations sleep. Their fountains slake our thirst at noon. Upon their fields our harvest waves. Our lovers woo beneath their moon. Then let us spare at least their graves." They did not, in fact, spare their graves. In the same journal, Anglican minister Reverend Henry Scatting wrote about an Indian grave called Sand Hill and stated, quote, "When the United States forces were landing in 1813 near the Humber Bay with the intention of attacking the fort and taking York, one of Major Gibbons's Indians concealed himself in a tree and from that position fired into the boats with fatal effect repeatedly. He was soon discovered and speedily shot. The body was afterwards found and deposited with respect in a little grave here on the crest of the Sand Hill where an ancient Indian burying ground had existed. Though long abandoned, it would seem that by some means the scalp of this poor Indian was packed up with the trophies of the capture of York, conveyed by Lieutenant Dudley to Washington." In the book Collections and Objections, Aboriginal Material Culture in Southern Ontario, author Michelle Hamilton writes, quote, "People created private curio collections to display in their homes or adapted artifacts for personal use. They planted flowers on human skulls, boiled cattle feed in copper trade kettles, or as in the case of the York grave, referring to Sand Hill, turned the sand covering burials and even the human remains themselves into construction materials." End quote. York, later named Toronto. As European settlers and colonists entered southwestern Ontario for settlement, they began turning up the land to build their homes and towns. Early Canadian infrastructure then was created not only through the dispossession of land and violence on Indigenous bodies, but with the ancestral bones of Gete and Anishinaabe. It was thought that burial sites and other sites of significance were abandoned. Due to the seasonal migration of many Indigenous groups in southwestern Ontario, however, those sites weren't abandoned. They were resting and would be revisited as Indigenous families moved with the seasons. In 1907, Mark Raymond Harrington, an American anthropologist, embarked on an expedition to purchase cultural items from First Nations people in southwestern Ontario. He was curious about the Lenape bands in the area, but encountered many First Nations along the way. In the image on the left, Harrington is pictured wearing Haudenosaunee clothing. On the right is a picture Harrington took while visiting Deishkun-Zibing. Pictured here is David Seneca and a young boy. In Harrington's notes, David was listed as being Ojibwe, and it turns out that David sold quite a few things to Harrington, including a bow and arrow and a small model wooden house. During his expedition, Harrington visited First Nation communities from Walpole Island to Akwesasne territory, knocking on doors, asking to buy what little remained of their old cultures. Some of these First Nations are listed here: Bekejwanong, Walpole Island, Amjinong, Sarnia, Ilanapewi Lakawit, Delawares of Moravian Town, once Delaware Nation, Six Nations of the Grand River, and up to Akwesasne. In 2019, as I began searching for Deishkun-Zibing Gete and Anishinaabe, I located Harrington's letter notebook after reading an article he wrote about his expedition in Ontario. His notebook documents everything he purchased and who he purchased it from. Over 430 purchases were made on that trip. In 2022, as I began conducting research for my PhD, I visited Gete Anishinabeg that Harrington acquired in 1907 and had sold to the American Museum of Natural History in New York. One item that I requested to see was on display, and I became increasingly aware just how out of touch these displays were, which is no surprise, but I was astonished to learn about how much information was missing. The label in the case stated, quote, that the designs on the bags are usually different on the two sides. This bag has underground panthers on one side and zigzag bands on the other, Ojibwe. In Harrington's notes about the purchase of this piece, he wrote Mishkimut, which in Ojibwe Mowin refers to a medicine bag. When I visited the American Museum of Natural History archives, I located a description of this bag, and it stated the following: a fine and typical specimen made of slippery elm bark fiber threads, twisted by rolling on the thigh. The designs on one side represent panthers, used to store and carry small articles, from Eliza Delary, Munsey Reserve, Ontario, Canada, collected by M.R. Harrington. As I continued looking and continued my research, I began seeing more and more family and familiar names. Before I started this journey, I remember hearing colleagues who also do this work about how lines of relationality and kinship were severed when ancestral belongings were taken from our communities and families. And through my research and journey, I have been working, as many of us, slowly but steadily to reconnect and reestablish some of those lines of relationality and kinship. As I explore Gete Anishinabeg in an Anishinaabe context, it becomes a process that includes prayer, offering, sema, tobacco, smudging, singing, and ceremony. This work is only further enriched by conversations with family and community. When I first read through Harrington's notes, he made reference to a purchase he made from Julia Delary. In Ojibwe Mowin, he writes, Wagak dos Bawagan, a tomahawk pipe. When I went to the American Museum of Natural History, I didn't know what the Wagak dos Bawagan looked like or if it was even there. But after finding additional information in the archives, I located the Wagak dos Bawagan, and here are a few images of that pipe that Julia sold to Harrington. Knowing that there was a Julia Delary in my family line, I went to go speak to my mother and aunts to learn about who Julia was. My Aunt Sherry shared this image with me, and I learned a lot more about Julia, who was a mother, a grandmother, and community member. And I learned that she was a pipe carrier, a healer, and a basket maker. In 2023, I invited a group of women from Chippewas, the Thames First Nation, to join me as I conducted research at various museums in Ontario. We went to the Canadian Museum of History, Library and Archives Canada, United Church of Canada Archives, and the Royal Ontario Museum. In the image on the left, my mother and Sarah are inspecting a snakeskin bandolier bag and headdress at the Royal Ontario Museum. Sarah was interested in the beaded figure on the bag, which she thought resembled Nana Bojo, one of our earliest researchers and teachers, an important figure in Anishinaabe stories of emergence and understanding our world. The materials they are looking at belong to the wife of Chief John Tecumseh Henry. In a catalog created by the collector, it stated that, quote, these and other articles in this collection were worn by Chief Henry and his wife when they represented the Caradoc Indian Reserve and presented an address to the Prince of Wales on the occasion of his visit in Canada in 1860. In the collection at the AMNH, the owner or wearer is consistently referred to as Mrs. John Henry. No one knew her name. As our group talked more about the piece and who Mrs. John Henry might have been, one member of our group said her name was Nancy Henry, and that was one step closer in understanding who Mrs. John Henry was. When we visited the Canadian Museum of History, the curator wanted to bring out some unusual items for us to look at, so she brought out a Pepsi can shaker. We didn't know much about this shaker, but when we were taking our leave, a member of our group, who is an Ojibwe language and knowledge keeper, wanted to sing a song for the Gete Anishinabeg we visited. She grabbed the shaker and sang the most beautiful song that ended our time at the museum. Singing became a very important part of our visits. We sang out to Gete Anishinaabe as we began our visit, to call out to them so that they could respond, and we ended our visits with song to honor them and our time together. In March 2024, at the Mount Elgin Indian Residential School Survivors Gathering in London, Ontario, I shared some of my research during the two-day event. I shared images from Harrington's collections and the photographs he took. As I was talking about spoons, a member of the audience shared that she recalled a story she once heard. In her story, she said she recalled a woman saying that her marriage was not official because her husband did not make her a spoon, inferring that spoons, like the one pictured here, were at one point a symbol of marriage and commitment. These moments provided additional information for further looking. Names that have been obscured in museum records are uncovered. A Pepsi can shaker took on significant meaning when an Ojibwe language and knowledge keeper used it to sing a song honoring the Gete Anishinaabe, emphasizing how in museum collections they can be reactivated as vessels of living tradition. Who would have thought that the carved wooden spoons had meaning beyond their utilitarian purpose, that they may have held symbolic weight in relationships representing love, partnership, and commitment? Together, these items reflect the resilience of Gete Anishinaabe and oral traditions. They also highlight the importance of reconnecting museum-held items with descendant communities, allowing for new interpretations, personal stories, and the reaffirmation of cultural knowledge. On January 23, 2025, I attended the Return of Our Ancestors initiative held in Windsor, Ontario. At this gathering, First Nations in southwestern Ontario were introduced to 14 sites where the remains of Gete Anishinaabe were taken from. Preparations are taking place to return them to their communities of origin. This gathering marked the beginning of bringing our ancestors home, and we were told that there are many more coming. During this gathering, we were taken on a tour of Windsor, and I wanted to share some of the things that I've seen and heard. And a few of them are at the banks of the Detroit River, which was a major meeting place for Great Lakes tribes, are covered in the remains of Gete Anishinaabe and relative tribes. Under the columns that hold up the Ambassador Bridge are a handful of little mounds that mark where ancestral remains reside. And early settler accounts recall the Detroit River being so full of swans it was hard to navigate a canoe across the water. Today, the work to reconnect with Gete Anishinaabe continues. We are also preparing to meet with the American Museum of Natural History representatives to discuss the return of Gete Anishinaabe that Harrington removed from our community over 100 years ago. And I look forward to being there when they are returned. In closing, I leave you with this drawing that my mother created while we were visiting the Canadian Museum of History. At the bottom, she wrote the words, inspiring hope, creativity, and seeing an Anishinaabe future, and that Anishinaabe will always find a way. Miigwech.
Good morning. I'm really humbled to be included in the events of yesterday and today, and grateful for all of the work that got us here and brought us together, from picking themes and organizing the conference to picking people up at the airport and making our food. I also want to apologize. I'm a nerd and an academic, and this is a bit of a scholarly paper. But speaking as a non-native academic, grateful for the sense of belonging offered by my community. I want to say that this talk could not have happened without the privilege of being an ongoing conversation with students, colleagues, artists, curators, and other knowledge keepers who stress the stakes of our work is always to maintain sovereignty and cultural vibrancy for Native nations. What I want to focus on today is how settler scholars and curators like myself are responsible for what questions we ask when engaging with museum collections. In 2013, when the Columbia Library hired a new curator, I learned the university held a collection of over 300 works, made by Indigenous artists living in what is now the United States and Canada. Since then, I've supported efforts to properly care for this collection, organized 3 exhibitions with students, and advocated for a more robust commitment to NAGPRA requirements. The history of this collection is typically demoralizing. These works formed part of a larger teaching collection assembled by Wendell Tur Bush, a professor of religion in the early 20th century. He displayed them in Columbia's main library and left the collection to the university upon his death in 1941. There are no provenance records that tell us how Bush accumulated these pieces. Though some of the work was clearly made for sale and continues to bear price tags, other pieces may have come to him through less honorable routes. Certainly did, for sure. Under-resourced and understaffed, Columbia's art properties has nevertheless worked to reconnect them to their histories and communities. While it will take time and work to identify who made and used and cherished these pieces, the collection nevertheless demonstrates signs of these pasts. One case in point is this pair of moccasins, tentatively identified by Dare Turner as Lakota. Featuring bold red quill work, stripes, and encircled by a frame of mostly blue beadwork, this pair has been dated to the last quarter of the 19th century, meaning it was likely made after the confinement to reservations, a time when Lakota needlewomen were producing moccasins for new occasions, including ceremonials held during the 4th of July, perhaps a reason for these colors and motifs. Participation in Wild West shows, and other occasions that allowed some sustaining of Lakota practices in the face of colonial erasure. Something that wasn't erased from these moccasins when they entered the Bush collection is the record of their wearer's relationship to them. For the imprint of a specific foot is visible in the interior and on the sole of each moccasin. Signs like these point to a kind of belonging that goes beyond ownership to wearing them as an act of cultural belonging. I was able to consider these moccasins with my former student, Sam Slater, now president of the Diné Studies Conference and also a moccasin maker. Sam teaches Diné people to practice kinship by making and wearing moccasins and sees them as an expression of respect and responsibility. For Sam, a moccasin offers connection to creation, to histories of migration, to relations with holy people and with buffalo and other animals that nourish the community, and to contemporary discussions about what has been or could be passed down. A primary focus of my scholarship is how works of art made to circulate outside Native contexts can be seen nevertheless as expressions of cultural belonging. For most of the rest of this talk, I want to expand on something I wrote recently about Edmonia Lewis's 1866 sculpture, The Old Arrow Maker, which I wrote about for the current Smithsonian exhibition, The Shape of Power. The Old Arrow Maker is, in the show, is one of several of Lewis's works that draw on Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's epic poem, The Song of Hiawatha. She produced at least 4 copies of this tableau and also used the head of Minnehaha as the model for the later double figure Hiawatha's Marriage, as well as for pendant busts of the 2 lovers. While Lewis, the daughter of an Anishinaabe mother and free Black father, has been continually celebrated as an ambitious and successful Native artist, most scholars focus on her relationship to a settler art world, a relationship that required negotiation with the tendency to see her work through racist lenses. Kirsten Buick, for example, ascribes to her a strategic willingness to capitalize on her identity in sculptures that affirm colonial patriarchal values. Buick and others have noted that a childhood spent with Lewis's mother's relatives, Mississauga relatives, informs her work, but say little about how it might express a sense of tribal belonging. Buick reads The Old Arrow Maker, for example, as an image of souvenir makers at work in a marble piece that commodifies Native culture for outside consumption in a way that reflects Lewis's larger practice of catering to settler collectors. I acknowledge that it is essential to learn about Lewis's often painful negotiations with the white art world, but it is also essential to look for ways the work embodies cultural knowledge, which might be done through examining her demonstration of the significance of material practices. Of all of the scenes in Longfellow's poem, Lewis chose for this her first example, drawing on it, a scene where Hiawatha presents a deer he has hunted to the father and daughter, interrupting the former's shaping of an arrowhead. Minnehaha looks up from her own work, described by Longfellow as plaiting flags and rushes. The work in her lap is an example of the bulrush house lodge mats that were essential to Anishinaabe life, being used to furnish the floors and line the walls of seasonal homes, and in its smaller, finer form, as a container and staging surface for medicine bundles. As Mikinak Miigwens has demonstrated, making these textiles is a practice through which Anishinaabe women encode relationships essential to the well-being of the community, relationships that extend beyond those kin living in the homes to the more than human protectors, Thunderbird and underwater panther, whose forms are cleverly embedded in the designs on many extant mats. Mick has demonstrated that Anishinaabe women continued this practice through the hardships and dislocations of the 19th century and into the 20th, in part to transform new territory into cultural space, incorporating new natural and traded materials along the way, reflecting the process of making relationships with these new spaces, places, and conditions in which they worked. Lewis's own family, members of what is now called the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, experienced these violent dislocations, and we know from the artist's own testimony that her aunts continued cultural practices of making throughout her childhood. In choosing to depict this scene from Longfellow's poem, the artist, living in Rome at the time, might be understood as making her studio Indigenous space as well, through remaking mats of stone. Material practices and their role in relationship building is integral to Longfellow's text. Prior to the scene shown here, Hiawatha's Anishinaabe grandmother Nokomis encourages him to marry a woman with, quote, skillful hands. Although Minnehaha is Dakota in Longfellow's story, and of course the historical Hiawatha was an Onondaga chief, Longfellow's presentation of Indigenous culture is indebted to the Anishinaabe. His primary source was ethnologist Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, who gained much of his knowledge from his Ojibwe wife, Jane Johnston, who grew up among her own mother's family in what is now northern Michigan, and who left recordings of Anishinaabe legends and original poems written in both of her languages. Notably, Johnston died in 1842 in Ancaster, Ontario, in Mississauga territory, and she and her work as a bilingual writer and scholar may have been known to Lewis's family. Regardless, the valuing of skillful hands is something she shared with Lewis's aunts. Another way Lewis may have expressed her belonging as an Anishinaabe artist can be found in her representation of moccasins. She gives Minnehaha and her father different styles, reflecting the differentiation of men's and women's footwear. In this case, and both of these examples, I believe, were collected at Lake St. Clair. So there's many connections to Mary's wonderful talk. But I'm using these just to talk about gendered footwear. So in this case, the women having a small vamp covering a gathered seam, and the men's having a seam down the top and more significant flaps. I noticed, this talk really stems in the fact that I noticed that different examples of Lewis's carvings of this topic have different moccasins. So she decorated all of the moccasins, but it was not a kind of rote repetition. So yet all of them show hints that seem to recreate beadwork and quill work on them. All three of the examples beyond the one I started with are less elaborate than Crystal Bridges, but each incorporates this embellishment. Could executing these designs have given Lewis the opportunity to apply her knowledge of making moccasins? I would say yes. And we'll note that also by squeezing the deer into this scene, something that makes for a very awkward composition, Lewis allowed her viewer not only to conjure up the presence of Hiawatha, but following Sam prompts me and perhaps others to think about how the gift of a deer might contribute not only to food, but also the hide that could be transformed into moccasins, objects that, like the mats, demonstrated relationships between Anishinaabe people and the more than human world that nourished them. We do not know if Lewis's aunts wove mats, but she told interviewers that they did make moccasins. Like Indigenous women from many tribal nations in Eastern Canada, Lewis's brief autobiographical accounts relate that her aunts produced moccasins for sale. Although this is more closely associated with the Tuscarora, sales may have taken place at the numerous sites for purchasing Indigenous-made souvenirs at Niagara Falls, which is part of Mississauga territory. Did Lewis help them with this work of cutting, sewing, and embellishing moccasins for members of their community? Regardless, she would have observed them at work. Anishinaabe historian Brenda Child has described the women from her community as holding the world together through their dedication to maintaining community knowledge and practices, even when the results of those practices left their hands through sale. Maintaining knowledge is what Lewis witnessed her aunts doing, what she depicted Minnehaha doing, and through her careful execution of Anishinaabe subject matter, she might be said to have done herself. Buick notes that there is no record of Lewis expressing concern about colonial violence toward Native people. Given the scant archive, which exists primarily in what settlers wrote about her, it is also important to note that there is no record that she didn't have concern about colonial violence toward her own community. During Lewis's lifetime, and this is traced a bit on the map on the right, the Mississauga witnessed dramatic loss of territory and rights. The expansion of the British settlement, the town Mississauga, here reflected upon by Haudenosaunee artist Jeff Thomas. The expansion of this British settlement caused the British to alienate them from their land. In 1848, the Mississauga ended up accepting an offer to occupy land within the territory of the Six Nations of the Confederacy of the Grand River. This reserve land has since been expanded with some acquisition of parcels of their original homeland, but more is to be done. While Lewis was in Rome contemplating works based on Longfellow, the plans for the Confederation of Canadian Territory were conceived and established, effectively subsuming First Nations within a new country. And in 1876, while she was still carving copies of Minnehaha, Canada passed the Indian Act, the comprehensive legislation which governs the operations of tribes and reserves. Could a representation of the relationships that tied the human and more than human world together be understood as a declaration of Anishinaabe belonging in their homeland, of their sovereignty? This is certainly an aspect of Child's idea of holding the world together. It is also something explored by current Mississaugas who've partnered with community member Carolyn King on the Moccasin Identifier Project. The project seeks to increase awareness and understanding of Indigenous treaties and histories through the installation of representations of moccasins from different nations across their homeland using stencils and other artworks. Importantly, the moccasins that they use as the basis for their stencils come from a settler museum, the Bata Museum, owned by one of the richest families in Canada and founders of a shoe empire. I'm showing you here one of the first initiatives that was established by the Moccasin Identifier Project, which involved carving images of an Anishinaabe moccasin along the waterfront trail in Toronto, also Mississauga territory. The Moccasin Project images are reappropriated, or should I say, repatriated from the Bata Museum, reminding us that stories of belonging are not just to be found in the historic works themselves, but also in the subsequent creations that perpetuate the significance in new forms, perhaps including forms like Lewis's sculpture. The questions we ask lead to the stories we can tell. I'm grateful to be with all of you here to tell stories of belonging today. Thank you.
So as Dr. Burns noted, I'll be reading on behalf of Carolyn Smith as a fellow California Indian. Thank you so much to the organizers of this symposium, especially Emily Burns and Eve Chavez. I wish that I could have joined you today. My sincere apologies. I look forward to hearing about the wonderful conversations, discussions, and presentations that are happening throughout the symposium. I am truly sorry to miss out. The relationship between Karuk tribe weavers and the baskets that they bring into being is woven within the very roots from which they are made. This relationship is a part of who we are, entwined with our past, present, and future. Therefore, Karuk baskets are to be treated with respect, honoring the basket's paths in the world. As both an anthropologist and traditional basket weaver, I engage with a holistic research practice grounded in Indigenous methodologies to recall and call out this relationship and the liveliness of Karuk basketry held in museum collections. Basketry is interwoven with our Karuk worldview and encompasses traditional ecological knowledge, language, and relationships. These interconnections reveal the liveliness and animacy of Karuk basketry. This paper engages with the concepts of onto-epistemology and belongings to show that Karuk baskets speak their own stories, which are much more complex than the physical properties of type, design, and use. The underlying theme of my talk today is a reimagining of holistic research in museum anthropology. When I say that this research is a holistic study of Karuk baskets, I mean that the practice of research is not about only interrogating the basket itself or parsing out discrete aspects of Karuk basket weaving practice. Instead, there is an understanding that the tangible, the physical form, is only part of a larger whole. Cultivated in Indigenous methodologies, holistic research forges questions and ethics grounded in relations. Sean Wilson states, quote, "The shared aspects of relationality and relational accountability can be put into practice through choice of research topic, methods of data collection, form of analysis, and presentation of information," end quote. He goes further to elaborate that there is an ethical responsibility to work in collaboration directly with tribes, communities, stakeholders, and individuals. Through relational accountability, collaboration, and ethical commitments, we can begin to move past the verbiage of the quote-unquote perspectives, particularly the Indigenous perspectives of those with whom we work, but instead honor the worldview that is shared with us by respecting and legitimizing the situated knowledge of those who may have an understanding that is different than our own. This way, we as researchers are not marginalizing the depth of knowledge of those with whom we work. We are not creating light and shadows, perspectives versus certainty. By thinking past perspectives, we can be supportive of the emergence of Indigenous futures by reevaluating academic and public understandings of research and histories, and by centering Indigenous knowledge and presence. And when I say presence, I mean beyond saying we are still here, which has been a vital expression of survivance, that we have survived physical and cultural genocide. We are still here, and we are members of sovereign nations, working and breathing life into our lands, cultures, waters, and communities. A holistic study of basket weaving can move beyond the silos of disciplinary boundaries and practices. When looking at baskets from a Karuk worldview, it is necessary to examine how the basket is interwoven with Karuk culture, how it is a part of Karuk society, and how it is a social actor within Karuk life. This means that there is a need to research not just the object or thing itself, but the environment from which it became, the spoken language in which it is esteemed, the spatial and temporal movements across the homeland and beyond, really its very living composition. Material, environmental, linguistic, social, political, and cultural, from which it is woven. One way to consider Karuk basketry with relation to worldview is with Karen Barad's concept of ontoepistemology. In configuring a knowing of the tangible, she argues that ontology and epistemology work in relation with one another, co-constituting how we know and what we know. She states, quote, "We do not obtain knowledge by standing outside of the world. We know because we are of the world," end quote. Thinking through this lens, it is possible to consider the aliveness and agency of the basket in relation with the individual as interactive, in the sense that there is an inseparability of mattering from the material and the individual. In this sense, Barad states that agency is an enactment, not something someone has. In this relational aspect of aliveness and animacy that speaks to the ways in which Karuk baskets are social beings in our society, enacting, emerging, and unfolding. Complementing Barad, Tim Ingold argues that because materials are impermanent, part of the process of making and remaking in the world, materials are, quote, active constituents of a world in formation, end quote. Rather than looking at a world in which the form of the object is what gives it substance, Ingold proposes that we look at the world of substance itself, how it presents itself to the maker, and how it is transformed in the dynamic act of creation. He argues that the form of an object is not transformed from one thing to another, but is instead built through a dynamic process between the maker and the materials, emerging, coming into existence, and changing both the maker and the materials. With regard to museum collections, when we are working in collaboration with Indigenous partners, what we learn is that there is an inseparableness of matter and knowledge, the tangible and intangible. There is an understanding of connection to each aspect of the world, that people are a part of the natural world, and the natural world is a part of people. Or as Vine Deloria states, there is a, quote, realization that the world and all its possible experiences constitute a social reality, a fabric of life, in which everything has the possibility of intimate knowing relationships because ultimately everything is related, end quote. This is why thinking with the term belongings as a way to respect the aliveness and the relationality of material culture resonates. This Musqueam concept embodies the continuity and co-creation of tangible and intangible knowledge that is present in Karuk basketry. Belongings are not possessions, but are instead an active, tangible presence with their people, history, land, ceremony, everyday life. Belongings hold the knowledge from their makers, family members, communities, and environments. This knowledge manifests itself in the form of stories, events, gatherings, ceremonies, language, and tangible cultural heritage. What is important to remember is that the knowledge about belongings, in this context, the idea of belongings, came from a collaboration among the Musqueam First Nation, the Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia, and the Museum of Vancouver, when they developed an exhibition called Ses Enam, the City Before the City, highlighting the ancient belongings that were excavated in the present-day city of Vancouver, describing how they are tied to, quote, the more modern histories of colonialism, heritage politics, and cultural resilience, end quote. The Musqueam collaborators spoke of belongings through the processes in which they were created and how they still belong with the people. More succinctly, Wilson affirms that the term belongings expresses the ways in which they are a part of the social world. Quote, the use of the term emphasizes the contemporary Musqueam connection to the tangible things themselves, but it also conveys that Musqueam have always been the carriers of these belongings' intangible qualities, including knowledge about the power they continue to hold, how they should be cared for, what should be said about them, how they should be presented, if at all, and how they fit into our ways of seeing the world, end quote. The warp and weft of holistic research of Karuk belongings entwine our past, present, and future. To provide an avenue to explore this, I trace the roots of Sipnuk Anamahash small trinket basket made by a Karuk elder prior to 1928 that is currently at the National Museum of Natural History. The life of the maker is embodied in the basket. Her and her tribe's history are entwined in each stitch. Nettie Rubin was a private person, choosing to weave and gather basketry materials in solitude. All of her life, she lived in Somes Bar, California, near the center of the Karuk world, Katamine. Even though she didn't prefer company when she wove, she was well known up and down the Klamath River as one of the finest basket weavers around. Nettie was born just 2 decades after the start of the gold rush on the Klamath River in a place that remembers the bloodshed of the California Indian Genocide. During her childhood, she must have seen her peers being stolen from their homes and sent to government school, although she herself remained home with her mother. During her lifetime, she must have witnessed the devastation of a subsistence way of life for many in her community who could no longer hunt, fish, or gather foods from such an abundant land. She witnessed the ending of many ceremonial practices that fixed the world and saw her community members turning to Christianity, even though she always carried the stories, songs, and knowledge of her elders. Nettie was a medicine woman from the Orleans area near Katamine, like all the women in her family were before her, learning to doctor from her mother. She also learned to weave from her mother, developing her talent over many decades. Nettie married a couple of times, and while she didn't have any children of her own, she did have a stepdaughter who she taught to weave. During the heyday of the arts and crafts era, Nettie wove baskets to sell, even developing new styles of handles and shapes which people far and wide were eager to buy from her. One thing she didn't do, however, was to deviate from traditional designs, even though it was encouraged by some collectors. The skill with which she wove and her generosity to other weavers by sharing her materials earned her a reputation for being one of the best weavers at the time. Even Louise and Elizabeth Hickox, who are well recognized for their fine work, remarked how much they admired Nettie's baskets. Unlike the Hickox women, however, Nettie would never sell her baskets to merchants or dealers. She didn't have to. One of Nettie's relatives stated, quote, "She never had to bring baskets to the store. She could hardly keep up with orders. People came and begged for her baskets," end quote. Through the window of our language, the Karuk worldview is infused with animate beings. Even though Nettie knew how to speak English, she just refused to. She kept to the old ways. She kept to the Karuk ways. And oh, she was a clever woman with a twinkle in her eye and a sly smile. In her later years, she worked with linguist William Bright to document the Karuk language by sharing stories with him. Not just any stories, though, but world creation stories that featured Coyote. Coyote getting in trouble, Coyote making the world, Coyote losing particularly sensitive body parts in the course of his devious but bungling schemes. Because of her, we Karuk people still have these stories which have come to us from our ancestors since time immemorial. Like so many others who lived near Orleans, her friend Phoebe Maddox would visit Nettie while she was weaving on the porch of her small cabin. Phoebe and Nettie would spend time chatting, and Nettie would tell her that her arthritis constantly plagued her from such a young age, saying, quote, "If they only knew how sore my hands are every day," end quote. This makes it all so much more extraordinary that her baskets are some of the finest ever made. So beautiful, each stitch even, each pattern executed precisely. The beauty of her work is likely the reason why Lucretia Monroe, the wife of a prominent lawyer from Eureka, California, purchased this basket in the 1920s. A few short years after Lucretia purchased this basket, she gave this and her vast collection of baskets to E.G. Johnson to sell for her. J.P. Harrington, a linguist for the Bureau of American Ethnology, purchased the collection in 1928 and had it shipped to Washington, D.C. Shortly thereafter, he brought Nettie's friend Phoebe with him to D.C. to document Karuk language and to study the collection of baskets he had purchased. This basket, along with over 400 more that Harrington purchased, have never been exhibited and has remained in the collection space at the NMNH. It has been seen and photographed only by a handful of people, but now its image is shared on the series database. This Sipnuk Anamahash small trinket basket is made with Ikedi tapkur, 5-finger fern, Koscheep, porcupine quill, Is Chahacheep, pine roots, and Sadip, hazel sticks. Each material Nettie gathered and prepared through the seasons and over the course of her lifetime, watching for signs that the plants are ready. The first bud of Pa'aduk, willow leaves, as the chill of winter recedes, looking for the pops of orange tiger lilies, raising their heads over the fields of Ikedi tapkur. She sung gathering songs, recalling the life of the plants, who were once the spirit people who populated the world before humans. The act of gathering these materials may have been an act of resistance, her act of resistance, since many of the traditional gathering areas stewarded for hundreds, if not thousands of years, were stolen by those settlers who occupied Karuk Aboriginal territories. Nettie's basket at the NMNH embodies her life, her livelihood, and her way of knowing. The Sipnuk Anamahash holds the ecological knowledge passed down to Nettie from her mother and her mother's mother through a long line of weavers, tracing this way of living in relation with the world since time immemorial, and holding the songs and prayers for fixing the world. And it speaks to the core of what it is to be a Karuk weaver, embracing Karuk ways of knowing, even though the world was changing around her, and the world continues to change around us. The women in Nettie's family are still weaving. They are strong Karuk women who have become leaders in our tribe, council members, program directors, revered cultural practitioners. Nettie's knowledge, Karuk knowledge, is alive in them. So to bring this presentation to a close, I want to weave back to the responsibility to conduct holistic research. Karuk baskets researched solely as physical things, observed coolly from their tangible properties only, creates a fracture in the knowledge that each basket holds, tearing apart its inherent beingness. It denies their agency, their own eminence. These belongings are woven with the physical roots of plants that were once spirit beings made in the world. This is the intangible knowledge of our Karuk lives and worldview, which is embodied in our belongings. If we regard baskets solely as objects, it denies the legacies of their makers who, despite genocide, assimilation, and boarding schools that stole so many children, as well as the lack of rights to steward the landscape that our ancestors have done since time immemorial, have survived, have raised families, have shared their knowledge with their children and communities. Karuk basket weavers have persisted in their part to fix the world, and in that persistence, our baskets continue to be interwoven into the very fabric of our lives. Thank you. So we'll be setting up chairs here on the stage for the panelists to respond to your questions. So while the chairs are being set up, please think of any questions you may have for the presenters.
There's two on the other side, but if you want to grab that like table. Do you want the table in the middle? Yeah, I think so. Are they? Do you need some? Oh, they're in here. I have.
Oh, okay. All right, well, that makes it. Maybe we can have an object on the screen. That would be nice. I should say belongings.
I put this one up. Yes. Much water if anyone needs.
Where would Clementine and Mary?
They're right there. Should I turn off the screen?
I don't know. I thought it would be nice to have something similar.
Okay, yeah. Okay, now try to sit right.
Can you hear me on this? Okay. Thank you to everyone for your amazing talks today. And I appreciate that you independently of one another found such commonality in the topics you brought up. Mary and Clementine, you both brought up the old ones. I think you both use similar wording and the relationality of belongings to the non-human relatives. And to start off our discussion, before we turn it over to the audience, I'm wondering if we can talk about maybe some of the ways we can look forward in the future of the discipline and the study of Native American belongings and how we can shift the ways in which we're teaching students perhaps to talk about the ancestral belongings and even how we talk about what is being made today in distinction from the art for art's sake categories that we are so used to distinguishing. So maybe you could provide some perspective on how you're presenting this knowledge in the classroom and how we can shift the narrative.
Yeah, I think one of the first things that I think about is teaching Native art history here at the University of Oklahoma, and teaching with Dr. Alicia Harris. So we started beading in our classes. So as a undergrad, or not as a TA, while I was doing my own work, teaching global art history and then intro to art history, having a module on beadwork and what beadwork meant to Indigenous people, as well as personally, bringing in my own examples of beadwork that I've done, and then having them do the beadwork itself as a form of appreciation, but to, also engage in the movement and the act of making and what that represents. And it was really, if you're not a beadworker and you're not accustomed to making things, and you pick up a needle for the first time and your hands are sweaty and shaky, and you got this big long thread that you have to deal with, you got knots everywhere, and it's a mess. but I think it's a good mess. So that's kind of one of the things that I think about when it comes to teaching, classes in public spaces. There are things that are probably not appropriate, for that space. And then I think about at a community level and a lot of the history and the impacts there in our communities. And one of the things that our First Nation has started doing, which has taken quite a bit of effort because of uh, you know um, inadequate funding and things like that, is hosting making classes and learning these practices again. And I talk a lot about family and community because it's very much my family that are also kind of leading these changes. So my mother becomes really an important person in kind of this movement toward remaking in our Anishinaabe and cultural department, and hosting these spaces for community members to come together to engage in the act of making and remaking. And I think those are beautiful spaces to be in, and those are spaces that I want to be in.
I don't have much else to add. I think that was a wonderful kind of introduction of the ethics of how we can teach about material culture, and that it is beyond right. I think this wonderful paper about baskets and how they are relatives in many different ways, and the two other Mary and Elizabeth, you both being able to visit these things in the institution, and that we are addressing these things on all different levels. So for me, it is a part of the making, right? When students understand what goes into that. And then also, I always try to communicate that it is a grounding in ethics. These are not just materials, they're not just objects, but we have this relationship with them. There was an artist that put energy and time into these things, but also that we're reminding our artists that they're creating this, they're contributing to this continuum as well. Because I think often they are in that art for art's sake because they want to have a career and they want to keep going, but how do we also have these conversations about what they're making for each other? And that, I think, helping students understand that there are all these different facets, right? There's not just one way of talking about creative practice, but that we can think about the making, we can think about the institutional settings. I just want to point to like Mary taking family with you. I feel like I've seen more and more researchers do that, which I think, and I usually have my sister along with me. I know some of you know my sister. I also Mary, but I feel like we're like dragging each other to things because we don't want to be alone, and academia is so isolating. So I think that's the other shift that's happening in the academy, especially with Indigenous scholars and tribal scholars, is that we're taking people with us. We're not doing this alone. We're also not going to visit these items alone. And it's often scary. I don't want to go in those collections. And I'm like, that's why I'm like, Mary, you go to the collections and I'll be waiting for you when you come out. But I think those are ways that we're trying to also help our students think about fighting back against that isolation that occurs in academia.
So I'll just pull out two threads that people hit upon as well. In my classes, I try to think about the maker of a piece as something much more than the person who did the last stage of assembly. So all of the natural forces and plants and animals, but also the caretaking of the things that become the final work or belonging that people encounter. So I definitely teach about the makers whose names are attached to the work, but also the other contributors to making, somewhat like was talked about in this last talk. And then the other thing that keeps coming up is language. And I am terrible at all languages, but I'm so grateful that there are so many wonderful things available where I can show people speaking their languages amongst cultural objects that I found through museums, that I found through research centers, that I found through scholars having their work recorded, so that I can bring the language into the classroom. And I'm constantly stressing to my students the way in which people visit with collections and speak to them and sing to them and take them outside so that they can get light and air, and that belongings are intimately connected to language. And so technology has been really helpful with that.
Thank you for those responses. And another theme that I was seeing and hearing in your talks is the role of museums and retaining the belongings that are essential to understanding these ancestral practices. And I'm wondering how you envision repatriation coming about. Is it becoming a reality? I know, Mary, you were just discussing some instances of it happening, but what are maybe some of the ways we can overcome the obstacles that our communities continue to face?
Yeah. So, well, where do I start? I guess, NAGPRA has been in the U.S. for quite a number of years, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done under NAGPRA and the new guidelines. And I didn't include this in my presentation, but that Mishkamut bag, the medicine bag, was in the Eastern Woodlands Hall at the American Museum of Natural History, and that hall was closed down because of the new NAGPRA regulations. And when I had gone to go visit those pieces over there, and I asked to, if they could be brought out of the cases, and they told me, well, we can't do that because it takes us $5,000 every time to open up that case, so we can't open that case for you right now. And I said, okay, well, I'll wait. I'll wait for that then to happen. And sure enough, they shut her down, and I'm hoping that those items are accessible now, because you only get to see one side of that bag. And just another side note here too about, you talked about Mick Miigwants, and she worked with Renee Dillard Wasson, and Wasson just has so much knowledge about those woven bags, and it's amazing to hear her speak about them. There are so many of them in collections everywhere, and she talks about them as being, personal containers for belongings, but also that they were, midwife bags, and that would, there's a reason why there's so many of them out there. And that they're special things that carry those necessities of life when those young ones are coming into this world. So I wanted to add that about those bags. So I think some of the challenges is getting an audience, or getting a meeting with those museums. The American Museum of Natural History was the only museum that I could find that had the information on the collection and where it came from, and who acquired it, and names. I was always, I was like, I wonder if I, ever find anything out there that belonged to people in our family, because those aren't things that, I grew up seeing or had witnessed in our community. And I was just so shocked to find them out there in the world, and that they were on display, and other people were seeing them, and we weren't. Right. So the challenges when it comes to repatriation is, for our First Nation and many other First Nations in Ontario, even across Canada, that kind of work is not supported. We're already experiencing, issues and in funding that in our communities, and funding is often not there to do that kind of work. So it takes, I think, a community effort, as we know and see across Indigenous communities, to put in that work. And that's one thing that we're kind of experiencing right now.
I don't have much to add. I'm not optimistic. I think that museums are colonial institutions. I think that these laws they put the burden on communities to do the work. There's some funding available. I wonder when it's going to be slashed and those staff members are going to be fired, at least in the United States. However, I think the most recent update to NAGPRA that insists on community involvement in the presentation works is a great step forward. And as I say to my students, we're not going to burn down museums. We're not going to decolonize a colonial institution, but we can intervene in them, and those interventions can be very powerful. And so, that is an inadequate half measure, but possibly the thing that's available.
I'm thinking about other ways that knowledge can be repatriated, right? There are digitizing projects that institutions are incorporating in their work, and funding opportunities to pay for community members to travel to museums. So I know right now we're in the midst of some precarious times, but there is still hope. I'd like to identify there is hope for knowledge to become more accessible, at least, even if the belongings are not being physically moved, right?
Agreed. And I think, more and more museums are designing spaces for the visitations to happen, more taking into consideration questions of how to welcome people into space and bring them in proper relationship with work. I think this is generational shifts, and, the future will bring even more.
So Mary and Elizabeth, you were more focusing on the older generation of practices, and I liked how Clementine brought us into the current day with your uncle's work. Are there examples you can think of with the communities that you're studying where there are living artists who are bringing this knowledge to the communities and the public today to make it more accessible?
Both the people that I talked about, who I have had the privilege of being a teacher for, are doing exactly that.
Yeah, I think there's also tribally focused organizations and institutions that are doing. I mean, of course, but in my own region, my sister and brother-in-law operate an artist gallery and studios called Racing Magpie. That they do classes, and it's where my uncle John Dwayne has a studio. And then there's also like the Oglala Lakota Art Space, which is operated by First Peoples Fund, which they now do weekly classes of making and creating, and also have a music studio, which is I was able to visit last week, and it's really exciting. I was like, wow, I wish I had this when I was a kid. I would have just probably not been an academic, because why? I know I would have been a linguist and a geologist and a artist, but I think there are these really tribally specific places that are, like Mary mentioned, right? They're in the classroom, but also outside of the classroom, and having this one-on-one FaceTime with artists and finding ways to pass that knowledge on. And then I've been able to work. I'm blinged out in like my Uncle John Dwayne's work, but also Melina Tubles, who's a quill worker and bead worker, and recently got into doll making. But I've been taking a class with her on beading and quill work, and right, that's also intergenerational knowledge that she's sharing. So I think there are a lot of artists that have been finding these ways to teach and share, and it's really exciting to see that happening.
I wanted to add, I know Carolyn's not here, and I don't mean to put words in her mouth, but also from the California perspective, there's the California Indian Basket Weavers Association, which provides workshops and opportunities for community members to share their knowledge with other members of the community who are not currently practicing, and also to sell their work. So going back to Clementine's point about how these practitioners still need to make a living, and sometimes that means selling their work outside of a community context. So there are different opportunities available to share the knowledge beyond the classroom.
I just thought, I don't know whether it's useful, but to think about outside of communities, but in terms of teaching, I've really been inspired by Native American Indigenous Studies Association when the local host committees actually start the conference with making workshops as a way of coming into country. And so often there's a conference workshop. And I think if that practice continues, to go out into the land and prayerfully gather materials and then come and have an elder speak about the work, but also while hearing about this artistic tradition, to actually be putting your hands through those practices. I mean, it's a little bit like what Alicia's doing in her classes as well. And while I do think that this is, vital for the communities, I also think it's vital for the people who are talking about the communities to, really make some of these connections and make them in a nonverbal, more haptic and more grounded way.
Well, I know some of our students are in the audience and they've participated in the workshops that Alicia has incorporated in her class, and maybe some of you are also attending the workshops that the student group, Indigenous Art Forms, is now leading. So I'll now turn to the audience if that's okay, and take questions. I see Holly has a question.
Can you hear me?
Okay.
When you guys were talking about going into collections and bringing people with you, but also like recording that, has anybody started doing video recordings of individuals in collections talking about the work? Because that's another thing, is we're also losing so many people who have this expert knowledge. And if you actually went into a collection and, like you're talking about, the bag where you could pick it up and look at it, and then also look inside it and then talk about the importance of it, because I feel like there's so many little bitty intricate pieces and icon, little images of things that are overlooked in this text that all of you were putting up, that the museums are putting out, that doesn't have anything to do with all of those meanings. And that would be a better database to begin, or even start to talk about getting funding to be able to share this. And also databases that are accessible outside of, I'm in the museum. Because trying to find this knowledge, I think, is our biggest problem, because it's so well buried. It's so well documented, but it's so well buried. So I don't know if that's more a question or a statement or whatever, but
I know there. I can't think of her last name right now, which is embarrassing. But there's a grad student at the University of Arizona from the Choctaw Nation, Jennifer. I'll remember it. But they did this during the pandemic, or right at the beginning of the pandemic. But she would go into collections, and then they had elders zooming in, and so they would have a discussion about some baskets and other textiles. And I know there's training. I think NMAI has trainings that they're trying to do a similar kind of, it's all newer, but to be able to be like, hold the basket up to the camera, And so I think there are ways that it's starting to happen, but it is still fairly new. And I'll remember Jennifer's last name. But she's a textile scholar. And so she really was like, how do we, because there are elders that don't want to travel and want to stay home, but they should be able to help us talk through those relatives that are in collections. So it is happening, but I think it's still a slow process.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. It's been a slow process. When I went to the American Museum of Natural History and I went alone, and for that one instance, and then I didn't want to go alone again after that. And then it just kind of happened, just spontaneously, that this group of women, which included my mother and Gina and Maxine, and Betsy and Sarah, were able to join me. And I didn't want to put a camera in front of their faces at that moment. And I guess I want to say it's preparing, them first, to get to that point, to be able to record. So I think it's work that needs to happen. Yes. So, and I agree with that. And I think that for me, and I don't, yeah, I guess for me, I was taking into consideration the time that they needed to adjust to this work, to adjust to being in museum spaces, seeing collections, to adjust to hearing the history, because there is a lot of hurt and pain, sadness, guilt, and shame that comes along with learning this history. And it, it's hard stuff to hear. And I also, as somebody who is coming to working with Gete Anishinaabe, I think that history of how things have been acquired is really important. And that if we're going to talk about beadwork, then we need to really kind of dig deep into that history, of beadwork, and how it came here. Discussions of colonialism and settler colonialism, right? Those are some difficult conversations to have, in the classroom, but also in community, right? So I approach it slowly, cautiously, and I'm taking my time.
I would love to see a program developed like that, where after, you've gone in and you've done like this initial stuff, then it's like, okay, let's set something up. And some people may not want to be in the collection. So just like you were both all saying, the personal aspect of being that close to an object, of being maybe too much, but to be able to set up a space and be able to properly record it and have conversations that become, because I know a lot of, like, the Delaware Nation just finally opened their new complex museum, and they've been working on digitizing their library and their artifacts or whatever it is. I don't even know what's there because it's been hidden for almost 20 years. And they're finally getting it out to where we can now access it remotely. And I think that's another part of this is, you can't zigzag all over the US and other countries digging through, trying to find things. And if things could get to a point where we could actually look at that, I mean, imagine opening up the conversation of how that pattern work looks very similar to this pattern work, which then I think we had a conversation the other night about there's so much more trade route than people realize with where we were trading and communing with people. And a lot of that is just being able to have access to understand that movement pre-settler. So
I think that's a great point, and I think tribal institutions will be helpful for that. But I also think that this could be one way in which communities can speak back to the requests from NAGPRA for collaboration and permission. Right? What is the reciprocity of supporting an installation in a museum? Well, maybe it's some of this work, right? Some of this digitizing or traveling work. Just two possible sources as places to also think about this. The current traveling show Grounded in Clay has an incredible digital accompaniment with many people going into the Indian Arts Research Center in Santa Fe and working closely with the collection and speaking about it in so many different ways that are really very personal and very knowledgeable. Also, I think it's maybe 2011 film, What Belongs to Inuit. I think it's Inuit Pingtikuit, but again, bad with languages, but on Isuma.tv was a project that took Inuit elders to several collections, and the things that they say are breathtaking. And then finally, the Arctic Studies Research Center, run by the Smithsonian in Alaska, has a tremendous video archive. And so I think a lot of this might have to do with communities' personal historical relationships to scholarship and museum collecting. I think both in Nunavut and in the Southwest, these are kind of longstanding histories where some of those negotiations have been going on for a long time, and maybe some of these discomforts that Mary's talking about are things that it's going to take a little time to get there.
Just to jump in with a quick comment from Adriana Gracie Green, thank you. She's speaking about projects that have recorded conversations with community members and wanted to point our attention to the Recovering Voices project at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, which hosts community delegations and collections and video records them and provides transcripts for participants. And then also the GRASAC, the Great Lakes Research Alliance, another site that has recorded museum visits with belongings. Thank you for that, those suggestions, Adriana, and for joining us online. Recovering voices.
There are a few questions in the back.
Hi. So I heard a lot of discussion about NAGPRA. Our NAGPRA kit is it's a reoccurring theme as we discuss a lot of our artwork, and especially some of the stuff that is no longer within our possession and was displaced from our homes. So as an artist who may have the possibility of going into these spaces where our items have been removed from our communities or our ways for a while, there is an interesting or a unique opportunity for us to maybe touch base when it comes to our ancestors. So my husband, he is a cultural director for our tribe. And when he goes into some museum spaces, one of the questions he always asks is, do you have any remains? And then once you get that, discussion started, and they will be very forthcoming, and let you know if you have remains. That would be a great opportunity for our people to at least capture that moment in time to say, yes, they're still there. Yes. Our I mean, because our artwork is valuable and it's important, but our ancestors, that's where that came from. So again, I don't know if it was a question really so much as just kind of bouncing off the discussion and noticing that unique opportunity.
Thank you all for this really important discussion. I really appreciate all of the work that you put into your presentations. I'm also really inspired by your work to engage settler colonial data and using a critical, not only just like your personal stories, but critical indigenous theory to interrupt that data to bring the things home. And I couldn't help but think about I do research on missing and murdered Indigenous women in the current context and political arena and policy, and how important it is that we help our students to revisit and to indigenize data in the ways that our communities need. And I found that really inspiring, and how inspiring also it is that you're bringing relatives with you, because it is hard work and it's heart work, and protecting. There are too many Indigenous relatives who get sick and are it just wears on your bodies and your spirits. So thank you for making sure that we also teach that to our students, because that is a practice, I think, to protect our beings when we do our work. So thank you.
Yeah, miigwech for your comments. Thinking about data and the importance of that, and going into museums where they're not really forthcoming with where their information is located, and just finding out the day you arrive that there's a separate, records room off, in the museum somewhere, and you don't factor that into your visit. They tell you to go find the file that tells you about this piece, and it's just like, well, what the heck, you could have told me this before I got here. Or going to, the museum, and it's not categorized in a way that makes it accessible to place or tribe or people. And it's, it just came from Canada. That's all we know. Or, going into the archive and you find a file that just has a date on it, but there's no other descriptions that tells you what's in those files. So it just becomes this really, you're getting the runaround, and that's exactly what I found in going into these spaces, and advocating for better descriptions, the metadata that is available online. And I know that museums struggle, with funding to do that kind of work, but I see that as a really big need for that to happen, getting that information together and out there. So thank you.
Other questions? Over to the side.
Not a question. Jennifer Bram.
Yes, thank you.
I will say that I don't know the layers. You know, every museum's so different. When I was up at Gilcrease, we did a database which was done through IMLS, where we photographed objects, and then we had 3 layers of access where elders, academics, and museums would all input data, and then it was behind a password access. So then community members could go to the TIPO office to access certain materials. So, but it takes a long time. It takes a very long time. So any help that you can provide, I think some museums just don't have the subject matter expertise to deal with the enormity of the collection. And I think that there's more and more people that want to engage in those conversations and put this information. So whenever I invite people in, no matter what their background or no matter what the field of study, I always make it a quid pro quo that I love the access and I would love information, because so many times you just don't know what it is. You know, you're finding yourself in an environment where you don't know who to contact, because it is as simple as saying Canada 1900. You're like, okay, well, where do we begin?
Yeah, thank you for that reminder too, that there are some really good examples out there of places, institutions, museums that are doing really good work in providing that. So thank you for sharing that.
Can you hear me? Dr.
Dr. Deliri, this question is for you specifically. So whenever you were doing research on this ledger, when you were following that trail, did the museum indicate they had any plans to digitize the ledger to make it more accessible to people?
Yeah, I think it is. Oh, I don't know if it's available online. I had to go through the archivist to get it, but I do have a PDF copy of it. So the ledger exists, as well as Harrington's photographs that he took while he was on his trip.
So the PDF, was that supplied to you by the museum, or was that something you had to create yourself?
Yeah, that was sent to me by the Smithsonian. The ledger notebook is at NMAI archives.
We're kind of wanting to do something similar at our museum, so I was just curious.
Tony Tiger, artist and independent Indigenous art curator. And I just want to thank you ladies for your time and your knowledge and sharing this day. Kind of a statement, I guess, and observation of our time. So the people in Oklahoma, 39 tribes. I think we have to remember that all these tribes, or most of them, are not people of this land. We were placed here, and so the materials that we find here are not the materials that our people grew up with, and I think it's virtually driving my creative process. Is I do like going to collections and looking at objects and things and see how they speak to me now as a contemporary man. But also what's important is if I curate an exhibition, I want to make sure it goes to Indigenous communities as much as possible, because our communities aren't familiar with, a lot of times, the information that we can have, the information that we lack, and the information that we need. And so when I go to when I show exhibitions, most of the time they're very grateful for that sharing of information and objects and knowledge. And so I just want to encourage, I think, any of our Indigenous curators and writers that we make sure that we try to connect with community and do that in a way that we find those individuals who are interested. And that's what I'm doing right now. So I'll be curating a Seminole exhibition, and it will start in Oklahoma, but we're bringing Florida Seminoles and Oklahoma Seminoles together and create a body of contemporary work about how our communities are continuing. But I'm all at the same time, I'm doing a Sac and Fox exhibition that will start in Oklahoma and then travel north. And so what's interesting, I think, to me is that I'm finding these individuals who have a like mind, and they're interested, but they don't know where to start. And so that's interesting too. Is that, I know that you probably had this again in your own communities, but just kind of a statement, but reaching out to our community, with these types of exhibitions and this knowledge that you've gained is so important. And I just want to commend you for that. If you want to speak to that, you can.
Question. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just quickly say I think I've spent my whole life being voluntold what to do by my community. So I've never not brought my community along with me. And there are times where I think we have to be tricksters and shapeshifters and, be in spaces in isolation. And there, being an academic or a scholar or in these spaces is not always easy, but we were tasked to do it, and that's why we're here. So I've never not had my community there with me, and also I think we also need to be reminded to challenge other people who have loose stories of connection for power. I know I said that in my speech, but I really meant that. There are people back home who could call me out and do, and I just accept it and then I move on. And I don't dwell on those things because I know we are all facing different challenges in ensuring that we are uplifting and supporting tribal autonomy and tribal decision making. But as was mentioned by Mary and several people in the audience, we are facing these challenges of settler colonialism, inherited heteropatriarchy, where we have to just listen sometimes and we can't respond. So I think we are, especially the Indigenous scholars in the room and the tribal scholars in the room, I'm very confident that they are all thinking about community constantly. But sometimes our battles in the bureaucracy of the institution look very different than the battles that are happening at different community levels. So thank you for reminding us of that. But I know that there are people who back home will call us on our BS and make sure that we're accountable. And I hope that, I'm like, I hope relatives are watching and are like, there she goes again. But, I think we all are balancing that in a very thoughtful way as best we could, and that we continue to grow and learn how to do it better each time. And so thank you for reminding us of that.
Yeah, Miigwech, I was just thinking, every once in a while, I'm like, oh, I gotta go take this home. Oh, I gotta go present this at home. I was like, oh, I gotta tell somebody about, every once in a while that kind of comes up, and I'm like, oh, I gotta do this, But I think that's really important work that needs to be done and considered. And one of the reasons why I wanted to include this Ancestral Belongings Gathering initiative that took place was because a lot of these remains that or not a lot, but many of them, I guess, yeah, many, a lot, whatever, of those remains are, like thousands of years old, and that predate removal. And so they're not just, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, right? Detroit was a meeting place for many tribes, Sac and Fox, Ho-Chunk. They were coming great distances to, set up camp and receive gifts, their treaty arranged gifts from the king and things like that. And I sit on our board of education, and that was work that I felt compelled to do, and as a way of getting back and staying connected, because I struggled with being so far from home a lot of the time, and I needed to find a place to be comfortable, that I can carry some of home with me, and that, being a part of the board of education gives back in a way, and then supports, my desire to be amongst and with community. But we were sitting at a meeting, and of course I call in, which is, one of the things that needs, is changing in tribal governments and politics, is including your off reserve members, right? So that's one thing that I am trying to take advantage of, and to be present. But I was sharing, some of the work that I do. We do check-ins, and I told them about, this gathering that we went to, and there's a road that leads from our First Nation. It's called Longwoods Road #2, and I think goes, straight to Windsor, Detroit. And one of our ladies at the table said, I heard stories that my grandfather said that, that road was made because we made that road to go get our gifts, our payments, and our things like that from Detroit, when they sent those goods or whatever. So, and I was just like, well, that's amazing. And I pick up these kind of little pieces and nuggets of information, and that's exactly, Holly, when you talked about, recording and finding alternative media and ways to share these things, because that needs to be more than just, written down and shared, whenever, it comes up. So I think that there has to be more done in more media to preserve some of these things and these stories.
Hi, Alexandria Robinson, Oklahoma Native and Cherokee tribal member. I've noticed in all of the talks, there's kind of an interesting intersection between belonging as far as ancestral history, as far as kind of having to work with colonizers and capitalism in order to make a living and therefore exist and thrive in like keeping the native knowledge. And I'm just interested, I don't know if any of you guys are from Oklahoma or if you've are aware of like the history here, as most of the tribes have been displaced. I'm interested to hear your comments on belonging in displacement, as Oklahoma kind of has to live in this native, like we have to like capitalize on native identity as like this ambiguous thing, because it's like how we make money as tribes. It's like the casinos here, also a lot of the native art museums are here, but it's kind of just this amalgamation of native. And I wonder if there's any interesting comments or what you have to say as far as like belonging in displacement has affected this interesting intersection in Oklahoma specifically.
I will attempt to answer that. I think first, it's a system that was created, so we are forced to be a part of a system that disconnects us to homelands, to non-humans, and I really appreciated the Karuk talk. Thank you, Eve, for reading the paper. But in that, right, there are places at non-human nations and relatives that know who they are and where they are located. And I think we, as tribal people who are migratory now because of technologies, that we become very cognizant of where we are, even if we were forced to be removed. And that's coming from a Lakota person who comes from a community that was very stubborn and wouldn't move. But I also spent a decade in Southern California, which I am moving back to California in the fall. And I've learned so much about erasure and how I ensure that I'm not replicating settler harm. And that I have to be very, very conscious that as a Lakota person living in someone else's homelands, that I'm doing the work to ensure that I'm uplifting the voices of that territory. So whether it's, Gabrielle and Otongva voices and in the LA Basin, or I will be in Amamutsan territory in Santa Cruz, I really have to challenge myself to show up as a relative and often an uninvited guest, and that I'm not replicating settler harm. And if I am, then how do I mitigate that? And that we really have to challenge ourselves that these ideas of diaspora and displacement were forced upon us. So what would our ancestors have done historically if you showed up to someone else's I mean, we know how some of our ancestors acted, but like, you know, some of us became interrelated and we cared for each other. And so how do we carry those things forward while untangling that settler harm? And that's the challenge, right? And I think that's the challenge we're all going to have as we see this breakdown of infrastructure in our country, is how do we become kin in a way that isn't about power, but about a collective care and understanding to move forward. And that is challenging. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy. It's very, very challenging. Because we have a lot of things that we've inherited that are not our own. And so how do we, and that's one thing that I've and will try to do and have tried to do as I've, migrated as a Lakota person to different territories. And a lot of it is listening. We have to be able to listen to what tribal people want, even if it's not aligning with our own ideas of the world.
I think that's beautiful, and I, everything that you just said, and it's really important to uphold that. And I just think about the things that our families carried, right, and the stories that they carried, and what are those, right? And that's a part of looking and asking and that research, and it becomes a part of the experience and the things that we inherited. So I just wanted to, thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments and questions, and thank you to our speakers. It is now time for us to have some lunch, and everyone in this room is invited to lunch, so please join us across the street in the Old Faculty Club at the Russell Center. Also, a reminder that the Indigenous Art Forms group is sitting just outside the door with beadwork for sale, so stop by their table on your way out. And then we'll reconvene back in this room at 1:15 for our next roundtable panel. Please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers and chair.